In my last video, I described how I designed my timber retaining wall. In this episode, I'll talk about jigs I made to ensure straight cuts and vertical holes. So this will be a deep dive into how to make and use these jigs. So stick around. I decided to cut and dry fit the main triangle in my driveway rather than on the steep embankment. I felt it would be safer and more accurate working on flat ground. I did end up doing some cutting on the embankment, but you'll see that later. Anyway, I wanted to make my cuts as accurate as possible to minimize gaps and wonky joints. That was challenging because I planned to use a chainsaw, which isn't the most precise cutting tool in the shed. I decided to mark the cut lines using a circular saw to make shallow scoring cuts. Now there are lots of ways to make cutting lines, as I'll demonstrate later. I find though that a shallow scoring mark is easiest to see when you're using a chainsaw, and the chips are flying. Now I admit, this is overkill. There are faster ways to set up a cut, which I'll show later, but let's start with the overkill method just for comparison purposes. I made a simple angled cutting jig to guide the circular saw, kind of like a track for a track saw, except smaller. Once set up properly, this jig makes angled cuts fast and foolproof. At this point, I rotated the timber 90 degrees and continued the guiding cut, this time perpendicular to the length of the timber. Finally, the chainsaw cut. I sighted the bar along the angled mark and I made sure the bar went straight down. Eventually, the timbers for the main triangle were cut to length. I laid them out in the driveway using a giant angle finder to make sure that the V-shape was 82 degrees. I should point out that the stack is upside down. In the actual installation, the longest timbers will go on top and the shortest will go on the bottom. Here in the driveway, that's reversed. The upside down dry fit made it easier to drill holes for the rebar pins. I'll explain that later. Okay, back to stacking. I wanted to make sure the timbers were snugged up tightly with no gaps, so I used clamps to pull them together. My longest pipe clamps weren't long enough, so I hooked two together. Once I got the first course positioned, I stacked the second course with ends overlapping in an alternating pattern. This log cabin style stacking locked the timbers in place. At this point, I was ready to drill some holes. I got this 3/4 inch auger bit from Harbor Freight. It has an effective drilling depth of about 14 inches. It's not quite long enough to drill all the way through two 8-inch timbers, but that was fine for my purposes. My plan was to drill a hole deep enough to accept 1/2-inch rebar cut to 13-inch lengths. Remember, the timbers were arranged upside down in my driveway, so any hole drilled from the top would be turned upside down in the final installation. I wanted the holes to be drilled as close to vertical as possible. With 14-inch drill depth, the bit can wander quite a lot. I ended up drilling about 15 holes for the main triangle. Every timber got at least 2 holes to pin it to the adjacent timber. Those which overlapped a perpendicular timber got a 3rd hole. If you found this video useful or entertaining, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. Also, please check out the other videos in this series. Thanks for watching.